I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to the RANE Insights podcast from RANE Network. In this episode, RANE founder and Chief Collaborative Officer David Lawrence chats with Jeff Brown and Michael Kenny of Arete, a global cyber risk company whose mission is to transform the way organizations prepare for, respond to, and prevent cybercrime. Jeff Brown is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Arete. Jeff has been an intelligence and security leader in both the public and private sector for more than a decade. Prior to Arete, Jeff was the Vice President of Global Intelligence Platforms with Recorded Future, leading efforts to deliver the company's intelligence cloud offerings to global governments. From 2016 to 2022, Jeff was the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of New York, a position focused on cybersecurity and aggregate information across all 100-plus New York City departments and agencies. He worked with former New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio and founded the New York City Cyber Command, reporting to City Hall and charged with consolidating and leading the city's enterprise cybersecurity strategy, directing response to cyber incidents, as well as advising on New York City's overall cyber defense. Michael Kenny is the Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations at Arete. Prior to his role at Arete, Michael worked as the Chief of Staff for New York City Cyber Command, a role he held from 2017 to 2021. From 2021 to 2023, Michael was the Chief Technology Officer of Consortium Networks, focused on cybersecurity incident response, management, insider threat detection, and cyber policy. In this episode, you will get insights from two leaders in enterprise cybersecurity and how to better prepare your organization before a cyber attack. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Jeff and Mike, this really is a very, very special honor to be able to have a timely conversation with two of the leading experts in cybersecurity, and I'll call it at this point cyber warfare, and hopefully having a conversation about a very timely issue, and one that'll be both insightful and I think also very, very helpful to our audience. So again, thanks for agreeing to do this. I thought we might begin just with a slight introduction. Jeff and Mike, and you both have had great careers, but truly distinguished public service in, I'll say, standing up and leading New York City's Cyber Command Center. And I thought maybe we would start there in terms of your stewardship, your experience, and some of the lessons that you learned along the way. And obviously you've had an intervening stop, both of you, and are now leading the efforts at a terrific company that's not only serving the private and public sector, but doing a lot of great public service work, Arete. But maybe we'll just start with New York City Cyber Command.
Happy to do so. So thank you, David and the team at RANE, for giving Mike and I the opportunity to join you for an important conversation. I think for us, anytime that we have the chance to talk about cybersecurity, technology risk, enterprise risk, business interruption, and the effects on our national economy and sort of global commerce, we're excited to do so, and we want to do so humbly because, of course, there is an entire ecosystem of individuals, both private sector and in the public sector, that contribute so much to things that that are absolutely critical for a successfully functioning society. So again, thank you, and we hope this session is informative and useful to the RANE audience. By way of very quick introduction, Again, my name is Jeff Brown. I'm the current president and chief operating officer of Arete, a company that exists in the epicenter of cyber response and the management of cyber risk across a whole host of different types of enterprise environments, going all the way to small and medium businesses and all of the elements that are necessary for the success of commerce and success of public services. We'll get into that later in the conversation today. Previously to Arete, I worked at the largest commercial intelligence company in the world, Recorded Future, and concentrated on bringing the insights of their intelligence platform to global governments in service of their mission. And I'm really proud of what that company does each and every day. As you highlighted, David, and we'll talk about it today, I had the incredible honor of being part of New York City's civil service in the capacity of being the founding director of New York City Cyber Command and the chief information security officer for 6 years under the de Blasio administration. I'm also a member of the Aspen Cybersecurity Working Group, a visiting professor at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, and a previous experience in financial services at JP Morgan Chase, and along with at the federal government level, going back to the beginning of my career as a staffer on the 9/11 Commission. So I hope I can bring sort of the insights of those experiences to the conversation today, but perhaps much more importantly than that, I bring with me my good colleague and close friend, Michael Kenny. So Mike, over to you for introductions.
Jeff, thanks. David and the RANE team, thank you. I met Jeff back at New York City Cyber Command as we were working to stand up that organization, and had the honor and the privilege to serve as the chief of staff there for the time that Jeff and I worked together in the city. My intervening stop was at a small cyber consultancy called Consortium Networks, where I was the CTO and led the services team there, focused primarily on large and complex organizations, not dissimilar from the effort of coordinating cybersecurity across the city of New York and the dozens and dozens and dozens of city agencies that were all in some way, shape, or form implementing a cybersecurity program on their own. That sort of coordinated effort and the intent on a collective and holistic defense is, a learning and a lesson that I brought from the city to my work at Consortium Networks, and that I bring to my role here at Arete, working with Jeff as the Senior Vice President for Strategic Operations, and again, kind of sitting at that intersection of cyber incident response, cyber insurance, government coordination, and ultimately the ongoing efforts to put a stop to the problem that is cybercrime, cyber extortion, and the like.
Many people in the audience are aware of incidents that have befallen other jurisdictions, such as Atlanta and Baltimore and many others. Fortunately, during their tenure, New York was spared, but New York was a very, very, and remains a very attractive target. So in discussing some of the issues for today's podcast, we're going to be drawing upon Jeff and Mike's, not only their experience, but I'll knock wood, guys, the success that you were able to achieve and the information and knowledge you were able to share and leverage with a much broader audience involving the government and private sector. So again, long-winded way of saying thank you guys for your service. Let me jump into some of the work that you've been doing at Arete. Again, this is your effort to share information and expertise with the broader community. Ransomware, people, I don't want to suggest that they're numb to it, but barely a day goes by without some reporting publicly, and forget what happens privately and undisclosed, of ransomware attacks on not only private sector companies but government agencies themselves, and witness some of the things that have befallen city and state agencies as well as the federal government itself. Maybe we can start with a common definition of what is ransomware, what are these ransom attacks, and why are they occurring?
Sure. So I can start there, David, on sort of the definition. And we think of a few different categories here, especially in the day-to-day work that we do at Arete. Ransomware, in terms of a malicious piece of software that then spreads around the network and locks up or renders unusable devices on the network, desktops, laptops, servers. That's what I typically think of as ransomware, but I think of ransomware under a broader umbrella of extortion events. Once the ransomware is deployed, the threat actor will demand some form of payment in order to release a key or a decryptor to unlock those systems. And we've heard a lot about ransomware. We've seen it frequently in the news, but we are seeing more and more of these other extortion events that may or may not include ransomware. You may have a threat actor who exfiltrates or removes data from systems on the network without locking them up, without rendering them unusable, but then demands payment to ensure that the data that's been stolen is not released, or to provide proof that the data that's been stolen is deleted. And as part of these ransomware and broader extortion events, we see other extortion related events, that may commingle with a ransomware event, like a distributed denial of service attack on an organization's website while they are dealing with a ransomware situation, and similarly demanding payment in order to put an end to that type of attack. So we see ransomware under the broader umbrella of cyber extortion events that all tie back to a threat actor who is demanding some form of payment in order to make the pain stop.
I would add to that the corollary for an enterprise as they're thinking about the definitions of ransomware, extortion, and really the criminality that exists on and through our modern technology and internet connectivity. The corollary is that an enterprise can think through its preparedness in a way that allows for them to tie all of these activities to the possibility of their business interruption, their regulatory burden, and their testing regime against those contingencies. So, since the concept of ransomware ties so closely to the business itself, it is not just the ability to mitigate an event through technology. It is the need to make sure that the business itself is resilient. Because of that, I think there needs to be preparedness that is highly involved by and then highly sponsored through all of the important business stakeholders. It really brings everybody together, and in order to understand how to manage the eventuality with an outcome that's successful.
And David, just to go back to your question, you asked why, and I think as we discuss this topic of ransomware and cybercrime and extortion, the primary reason is a financial motive, and the financial motive exists and has existed for a long time. Businesses, governments today are more dependent on technology than they ever have been before, which means that Um, their systems being unavailable causes more pain more immediately than it may have in the past. Switching to pen and paper may not be an option in 2024. And and then I think we have a software development economy that prioritizes features and functionality over security. So in this, continuous push of new software and tools and technology that businesses, governments, individuals are uh, excited to adopt, you have likewise a continuous stream of potential software and hardware vulnerabilities that threat actors can exploit.
So, as I listen to both of you, I'm reminded of the quote that was attributed to the infamous bank robber Willie Sutton, who I think it was in the 1930s. There was a quote attributed to him when he was apprehended about why he robbed banks, and his answer reportedly was because that's where the money is. And so what I'm hearing from both of you is that because of the dependencies that we now have on technology, the security vulnerabilities that are there, that companies are in fact, and government agencies are going to continue to be targets of people who would look to disrupt, lock down systems in exchange for money, hence the term ransomware, and that this is a trend that is going to continue at least until some security solution or law enforcement solution is affected. Is that more or less a fair summary?
I think it's a very critical realization, David. When you are able to pull a quote from over a century ago that is exceptionally relevant today, what that tells me is that we are looking at continually improving our ability to mitigate and manage this criminal activity. I think we have to be cautious of the ramifications and expectations around an expectation that an absolute measure, i.e., a direct technical solution or a direct legal solution, will result in something absolute against the criminal landscape. Because what criminals do is pivot. If you look at what Mike Kenny has highlighted as he explored the definitions of ransomware, looking at these types of operationally disruptive software packages from the past is not good enough, because criminals said, okay, well, how do we pivot this extortion and add new variables to achieve our aim, which is to get a payment, to make money. And they will continue to do so. And I think what that highlights is something we learned in our time developing and operating New York City Cyber Command, which was as much technical visibility and as much technical control that agency could, in our time operating it, employ against the city's technology environments across 100 plus agencies. That was an incredibly important journey to be on, and an incredibly important metric, operational achievement to help defend the city. But the city would not be the great city it is if it only relied on that control. It also had to tie the cybersecurity agency into the preparation and planning of other operational agencies, because in the end, providing a New Yorker with confidence that they would receive a service that was necessary, no matter the threat, was what the real obligation of being a public servant in that capacity was. And those lessons, I think, can be directly applied against the threats if you're, a private sector enterprise operator, i.e., have the best technical mitigating controls that you possibly can and use them and configure them to the full avail. But when you're thinking about how you're prepared to mitigate the threat, bring in all of the capabilities of the business, all of the various enterprise risk management tools, because if there's an interruption or a lack of confidence in your technology, you may be able to continue in a successful manner to deliver your services while working on the technology. And that in and of itself is a way of thwarting the ultimate intent of that criminal actor. And we can dive further into that in the conversation today, the ways that we've seen that be successful, both in our time together in New York City, but then also with clients today.
And Jeff and Mike, would it be fair to say, just so I can frame the issue for institutions, there was a former FBI director who once publicly stated that I think there were only three types of companies left in the world. The ones who have already been attacked, the ones that are going to be attacked, and the ones that are unaware that they are currently under attack, something to that effect. And what I'm hearing here is sort of the inevitability that at some point in time, no matter, your company, your industry, public, private sector, et cetera, enterprises should assume that they will be targeted for some form of ransomware attack. Is that a reasonable premise?
I think it is reasonable. I would append it by saying it is almost inevitable that you or your company will be impacted by an attack. For instance, we all remember the Colonial Pipeline interruption, and that impacted individuals and businesses throughout the East Coast, not necessarily because that individual or that business itself was experiencing a cyber extortion event themselves, but they were experiencing long lines at gas stations and the possible interruption of the pipeline flows, and that impacted them. So in a highly interconnected society, what we see is an enterprise themselves can be extorted, impacted. Their supply chain could be, even their customers could be. And in those ways, we all experience and are impacted by these events. And so we all have to think about where there are leverage points across our systems that can be brought to bear so that we're all participating in the management of that aggregated risk in a way that we can go about sort of our day-to-day and not all have to be sort of drafted into some cyber defense model, because not everybody needs to be a cyber defender. Everybody needs to participate in the management of cyber risk.
Okay. So with that said, let's assume either you've been brought in as you guys have been brought in as the Chief Information Security Officer or, a board member, and there's been a lot of publicity about this risk. Tell me what enterprises should be doing to be ready when and if an attack occurs. And when I say to be ready, it's not just in terms of the response, but basically, and I've heard Mike, you and Jeff talk a great deal about not what I refer to as prevention, but resiliency, the ability to maintain operations even if something happens, the ability to come back quickly, the ability to isolate and confine the problem. So let's give the audience some advice, knowing that this is a real threat out there, about some of what are things they can do to better insulate their organizations and also to be in a position to maintain resiliency if such an attack occurs.
Yeah, so I think in that framing, one of the key elements is to begin to look at cybersecurity as a risk discipline, to take some of the, let's say, the extra, scary depiction of hackers or ransomware, and remove that from the picture and say, look, we need to treat our cyber resilience as we would treat any other element of kind of business resilience, business continuity. Certainly, investments in preventing the cyber attack in the first place are important, but they're not sufficient. And the approach cannot be that we are simply investing in preventing the ransomware or the data exfiltration or the denial of service attack from happening. Organizations need to practice what to do if it does happen. And it doesn't need to be a crisis situation, especially in large organizations with established cybersecurity teams. They're likely dealing with situations every single day. And so taking that knowledge and spreading it throughout the organization so that others who are not dealing with these issues on a daily basis can better prepare themselves as individuals, their sort of departments within the organization, and the senior leadership up to the board level on how to deal with these types of situations. You can do that through tabletop exercises. You can do that through regular briefings or case studies. You can do that through some technical types of control tests, like a red team exercise or a penetration test. These are all steps that organizations can take to sort of test the muscle movement on a potentially disruptive cyber event. It should be no different than at some point a fire drill or testing the business continuity plan in the wake of a hurricane.
I'd like to add to that. I would offer that there are two questions anyone in an organization, let alone a responsible executive, two questions or statements that you never want to say, right? One would be, I never thought it would happen to us. Yeah, that's not a good one. And the other one would be, I assumed we had that handled. That's not a good one either. And I think if you start in some senses with, not having any assumptions and really getting granular in your resilience planning, your preparedness, your testing, then you can dispel the thought process that you haven't contended with, even if it is thought to be an edge case. Make sure that those questions are being asked. Because what we find with some of our clients is they appreciated cyber risk. They had cybersecurity programs, but in their planning cycles, there may have been a gap in truly testing the assumptions. For instance, and this is widely publicly reported as something that happens in some ransomware events, perhaps an enterprise has backups to its data, but perhaps the ability to reconstitute that data in a fresh environment to recover from backups wasn't tested in a way that the organization truly understood how long that process could take. And the length of that process introduces such business interruption or financial loss that an organization then has to ask itself, is this going to cost us more to take the time to get up and running, and will significantly impair our customers and services So now maybe we do need to consider the extortion demand of the criminal and then begin a negotiation process. So it isn't that the box wasn't checked, it's that it wasn't granular enough of an examination in order to truly execute on the contingency plan in a way that wasn't too disrupting or too damaging to the business.
Yeah, I just want to add to test these things does require some level of non-cyber expertise, some level of business judgment or assessment of business risk when it comes to a couple of key concepts. One is around how long certain elements of the business, certain critical systems can be down before there is a very significant issue. And the other is around an assessment of how much data, and you can segment this by certain systems or types of data, but how much data can we afford to lose, or what's the threshold where we need to make sure that we really do have a tested plan in place. This is potentially an operationally impactful event, or to use the language from the recent SEC regulation, a material event. These are the types of conversations that organizations need to have in collaboration with their cyber and IT teams, but they cannot happen effectively solely within the cyber or the IT team.
Okay.
And
I
let's
think,
examine it one more level of granularity that I think is important for the RANE audience. Um, in a scenario, for instance, where a enterprise says, like, our position is that we will never pay a ransom if we are extorted. In that scenario, the organization needs to be exceptionally granular in its contingency planning, its technology resilience, and its services redundancy, really. What happens at times in the landscape is you have an organization that takes that principles approach, which is highly commendable. But if the threat actor or criminal circumvents those controls and that victim is put into the worst circumstance possible, then the victim says to themselves, especially if they support a life safety type environment, health services type environment, critical infrastructure type environment, the victim may find themselves in a position where truly they have to execute or have at least examined and on the table the optionality, a full breadth of optionality. And what you don't want to happen if you're in that circumstance is to be working with great and fantastic security technology companies, incident response teams, and then and wonderfully talented external counsel, all of which Mike and I have worked very closely with in the past and are fantastic. I'm very proud of the services our own company delivers. But if an executive team wants full optionality and you're working against the problem, you don't want to be in the circumstance where the executive team says, okay, we just want to explore negotiations and we want to understand from a pre-positioning perspective, because we offer this thing that is critical to society, what it could look like if we need to make a payment. You don't want to be in a position where you as an enterprise risk executive or a CISO, et cetera, then says, okay, let me get back to you. And then you have to make a bunch of calls to find the organizations who actually do that. And that's one of the things that Mike and I are proud to represent Arete on is, very early on, 6 years ago when this company was founded, under the premise that we would never leave the victim and we would have the ability to put the options on the table. Our company's goal is to stop cybercrime. We want this to end, but we know that in service to a victim, we want to be able to offer them the full scope of options against the critical moments. And I think that's really important because you do not want to be making assumptions like in the incident. You want to be executing on your prepared plans.
Okay, so let me unpack a couple important themes because I don't want these points lost. Number one, the importance of preparing for these types of attacks. I'm hearing you guys say that. It's axiomatic, if I can use that term, that the worst time to prepare for something is in the middle of a crisis. So these are internal conversations and preparations that should be done. I'll call it in the relative calm of the moment, and that may include what I'll refer to as the tabletop exercises and scenario planning that represents what I'll refer to as a recurring pattern in these attacks. I'm also hearing, and I'm going to draw upon my not being the smartest person in the room, but I slept in a Holiday Inn last night, as the commercial says, and I've heard you guys speak before, that a company has to, as part of the preparation, make an assessment about their data, what really matters, understand redundancy, understand keeping certain data safe, so that if there is an attack, it can still be recovered and accessed. And also, again, Jeff and Mike, I know you led this effort through the city and you preach it. It comes in the category of maybe the obvious or common sense, but to make sure that your company's software and systems are up to date in terms of security patchworks, but also that you are testing for vulnerabilities constantly. And that doesn't have to be a high-end or disruptive exercise, but having appropriate internal and external resources to scan your systems, understand the vulnerabilities, understand where some things may be occurring. And as I guess both of you alluded, these attacks can come through various portals, including your vendor system, your customer base, et cetera. But I'm hearing your continued preaching of those, I'll call them points about enterprise hygiene. Fair summary?
Yeah, I think that hits the high points. The decommissioning of legacy systems, or the opposite side of that coin, keeping your current systems up to date, is incredibly important. Also easy to say and sometimes difficult to do. And I think anyone who works in a large and complex organization that's been around for some time will understand that there may be systems that simply cannot be updated or cannot be easily decommissioned. And so knowing where those are and treating them with the special care that they need is important. Certainly in an organization like the City of New York, we used to say, it's been doing technology for 40 years. There is stuff that cannot just be easily replaced with something new, and that requires a special level of attention.
There's a point on this too to keep in mind, which is making sure that any enterprise is holding to account the providers of their compute for the highest levels of security, redundancy, and other variables. There is this notion that I'm very supportive of, which is secure by design, secure at delivery for software. These themes are shaped through efforts that I'm a big fan of, like the most recent White House National Cybersecurity Strategy and White House National Cybersecurity Strategy Implementation Plan. And I know in conversations with the companies that provide the vast swath of compute, those companies themselves are taking these measures incredibly seriously. I think that's important because we can't forget that though many of the RANE audience represents large enterprises, where there is almost underreported impact to the national economy is in the small and medium business space. So even though we read on headlines when there is a major event against a major multinational company, what we're not reading about, but what Arete responds to each day, even today, are the impacts to local businesses. And I think as we're thinking about and leading conversations around what the future of secure technology and the important regulations around that technology and the important interconnectivity, interoperability of the cybersecurity community and cyber intelligence community, we can't leave behind the reality that there is an obligation to small and medium businesses in this country and the individuals that are employed in that space that is incredibly important. I get very passionate about this, and I know Mike does also, because in our time working for the city of New York, what we were really doing was working for each and every New Yorker. So if we were doing something that was only of benefit to a large company, a large agency, we weren't doing our job. And I think in some senses, Mike and I have carried that ethos into our current private sector capacity, because so much of this pain is felt by people who only operate in certain regions, who may have a company of 5 people, 20 people, 100 people. And as we think about making sure we're defending the largest sort of critical infrastructures that we all depend on in an interconnected way, we can't leave behind these small and medium businesses, because their livelihood, their services within their society, equally important. We live in a country built on the premise that we're all equal, and I think that we have to carry that forward in our work.
Jeff, what you and Mike have emphasized is that, look, this is an issue that affects everyone, maybe not just directly, but by 1 degree, 2 degrees of separation. So the solutions have to, think broadly about protecting not just individual organizations, but the people who rely on those organizations. And to state the obvious, but still for the audience, this is not just the disruption, ransomware for the disruption of organizational operations, but there's a lot of sensitive and confidential information that these threat actors will basically demand ransom in exchange for not releasing the information into the public domain. So there is a kidnap aspect to the data. There's also an extortion aspect to these plots. Now, we're going to be doing in the near term a webinar where we take people through a tabletop exercise of a ransomware attack. But just in a relatively brief fashion, Jeff, Mike, can you take us through the things that happen, and we'll call it the decision tree for organizations? I've just called you up as the head of a company and said, listen, we can't access our data. They're asking for the payment of a Bitcoin to release the data back to us, release the control. What should we be doing? What should we be thinking about? We need your help.
Yeah, so I can start there. One of the things that we'll look at when we respond to an event like this is, first getting an understanding of the general lay of the land. How many systems are we talking about? What's the deployment look like versus on-prem or cloud, just to understand um, kind of the environment that we're working within. We'll often take any information that's available, not dissimilar, David, from a kidnapping scenario, a proof of life. What do they have, and how can they represent to us what it is that they've taken? That gives us some information to further interrogate, what potential systems were impacted or what other data may be impacted. We'll begin a conversation with the victim organization and the appropriate legal counsel to make a determination about whether or not to engage in further communication with the threat actor. And that can include an element of negotiating the payment or continuing the conversation to gather additional intelligence about the potential impact to the systems that we're responding to. And we'll walk through sort of that full life cycle with the client, oftentimes with external counsel as well. There are, as you can imagine, a host of regulatory concerns depending on the industry and sort of disposition of the affected organization. And as Jeff mentioned earlier, we can walk through this whole process. There may be a decision or a calculus to be made about how far to carry the negotiations, or whether or not a payment is appropriate depending on the systems impacted. And these are the types of decisions that we would walk the victim organization through, and we would bring the data that we have from responding to on the order of 1,000 of these events a year, with many of the same threat actors or threat actor groups to bear in those conversations to assist in the decision making.
I think it's important, as Mike has highlighted us through sort of what we could consider to be that incident response timeline, the engagement, the process of assessing and planning with the victim, and then the important, containment and ejection of the adversary. It's all also part and parcel of a process of collecting the types of information sets that are necessary, because if a client wants to go down the path of having the optionality of a payment, within the negotiation facilitation space, there is an incredibly important and responsible process that at least Arete is committed to, that is in conjunction with the U.S. Treasury Department and all of the necessary reporting to make sure that we are checking the incident data against the lists that are published and the information associated on those lists of the U.S. government and other governments, to make sure we're not that we are identifying whether or not the threat actor is a sanctioned entity. We consider that to be really part of our counter extortion services, and we have a very robust strategy working in conjunction with the appropriate external counsel and the victim, because that part of the process is completely critical, and it's also a part of a process of response that I think at times is not well understood. And it's a part of the process that I think at least Arete has been exceptionally forward-leaning in building, our OFAC compliant process, for instance, to exceed the expectations of those governing bodies and regulations, because we think that's what's owed to the victim, to the client, to the circumstance. So we maintain our own internal no pay list. We do an incredible amount of analysis and the packaging that we need to do in order to help provide that optionality. And at many times, if needed, based on the information, of course, we may say that that is not an option, and we stand very firm in that regard. So I wanted to add that to your question, David, because I think it's an exceptionally important part of being able to help a victim in their time of need. To have a responsible party, not just, it is not just go out to a Bitcoin kiosk and get ready. You want someone at your side who understands to the utmost degree, those obligations.
So I'm going to, because this is how I've, since I don't have either your intellect or technical expertise, and I'm going to assume a good part of our audience is operating at my level, although obviously we have a lot of specialized experts. I've always found it helpful, Jeff, and you and Mike, in our presentations and some of my writings, to look at cybersecurity not through a digital lens, but through an analog one. And found it helpful to the audience, I think has heard this before, but quote a little bit of scripture, because the threats that are being faced through the digital portals of cyber warfare and cyber attacks are very much biblical in nature. And so I'll paraphrase, but in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. It's all been done before. It's all been said before. And what I'm hearing from both you and Mike is, I'll call it an analogy to a kidnapping case. Obviously, we're not talking about taking a human hostage, but there's a reason why it's called ransomware, which is then when data is being seized or company's platform is being taken over and ransom is being demanded. The same types of steps that an enterprise should be taking, God forbid they have a kidnapping, they're analogous to what is needed here. And Mike, you alluded to proof of life. Is there, do the people actually have the data? Have they seized aspects of our operation, or are they just sending in, a threatening letter that they're going to do it, or, misstating that they have done it? And Jeff, your point about running off to a Bitcoin kiosk and, grabbing a Bitcoin and possibly pay, analogous to running out to get a cash from the bank and being ready to pay without, actually knowing what you're doing and what the end result is. And your reference, number one, to proof of life, what do they have? Two, whom are we dealing with? And the nature of the adversary. Is this a party that's actually known? And when I say known to government authorities, are they on a prohibition list? The government has put out, as Jeff, as you alluded to, a OFAC list of parties that it would be illegal to make a payment to, or at least illegal unless you had permission of the government, and provided disclosure. So again, hostage takers in the physical world are often known to the authorities, and there's some people that maybe you can deal with and some that you can't deal with. The cost-benefit assessment of what's being asked for versus, Mike, as you alluded to, understanding how long can you be without particular data, or translate how long before something highly consequential happens to the organization. And then the negotiation process. Who's going to handle that? There are very few people in the corporate world who have any kind of expertise in, I'll call it, hostage negotiations. That's why very often, not always, when there's a kidnapping case, the FBI and local police are called in because they do have experience in this. And Jeff, you've alluded to some of the great work that Arete, I don't want to make this an infomercial, but Arete is among the leading organizations that's had a great deal of experience in representing companies and their advisors in terms of these negotiations. Are we actually going to have if we pay this, do we get it restored? Is it going to happen again? There are issues of specific and general deterrence. Do we make ourselves more or less vulnerable? And Jeff, you alluded to the insurance company aspect because the issue of whether a company is covered under an insurance policy is a critical one. So in terms of preparations, enterprise understanding their own insurance policies around cyber attacks is also critical. And I want to now just hone in on something where I know both of you guys have been very, very focused, which is attribution, actually knowing who's behind an attack, because knowing who's behind the attack will dictate a lot of things in terms of regulatory disclosure and potential negotiations or non-negotiations and reporting and I'll call it the calculus of what a company has to do. So Jeff and Mike, maybe you can talk about attribution and just a little bit of the negotiation process that very often takes place.
Certainly. So I'll start and then ask Mike to add additional context. So, at a very high level, I think when we in industry think about attributions, there may be one obvious part and two less obvious parts. The obvious part is classically within the cybersecurity industry and within cyber threat intelligence and response work, attribution has been exceptionally useful because then you can understand the tools, tactics, procedures, the operations, sort of the fingerprint of the criminal in order to then inform your defenses. And better yet, as a good member of the community, you can help help inform the defenses of others. And that's how security technology and information sharing regimes operate each and every day. Public-private partnerships, private organizations improving their security defensive technology, government organizations helping within that information sharing framework. So that's the obvious part. The less obvious part goes to a level of distinct precision within attribution that an organization wants to achieve if they in fact need to assure and document that the criminal actor is not, for instance, as we've said, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control's specially designated nationals and block persons list. So when you're talking about a legal precision in attribution, in order to have the optionality that we've discussed earlier, that is an additional level that I think is important. Then beyond that, it goes to, I guess, this third piece that I think is incredibly important, and you just highlighted it, David, which is the relationship of an organization with official government partners first, which is, in my perspective, if there is a crime, you inform the police. So I've always, throughout my career, been an advocate for directly and in a timely manner informing FBI, Department of Homeland Security, other organizations that you want to empower them to have the information, because they can then use their authorities to do the thing that they do on behalf of society. It is not that there's an expectation that they will come and run your incident response for you. It is that you believe that you are the victim of a crime and you want to empower the authorities to use their capabilities within the rule of law to do what they can do to go after those criminals. That's, I think, incredibly important. You also mentioned, of course, David, the insurance industry. and they can be an incredibly helpful and powerful participant in in mitigating the impact of the incident for you as your organization and beyond, as they underwrite this risk on behalf of society. They are playing a role through their policies and through the monitoring of their policies in improving the aggregate cyber hygiene that our society has to manage itself. So that's my answer, how I think about it. Passing over, Mike, if you have some additional context there.
Yeah, I would just add that when you're preparing, you want to work with organizations that have had repeated interactions with the parties on the other side of this equation. So that could be law enforcement, that could be incident response firms. Each of these types of organizations with repeated interactions with the threat actors have different levels of visibility. For instance, to the attribution point, there are many different factors that point to attribution, and as an incident response firm, we have visibility into many of them. The ransom note, the cadence of the communication with the threat actor, the forensic analysis of the malware, the movement within systems of the threat actor themselves. All of these contribute to a high degree of confidence in the attribution determination, and it's only available given a certain level of visibility. And so these organizations with repeated interactions, I'd say make use of them, rather than try to go it alone on what may be your first or second or third interaction. Go with the organizations that have done these thousands of times.
And so what I would like to do is basically see if I can affect a little bit of a summary without being glib. Number one, there are some things that enterprises can do in advance to prepare for these types of attacks. Insurance, obviously reviewing software security, legacy systems, I'll use your term, Mike, potential tabletop exercises, and understanding the resources both internally and externally, that if such an attack occurs, whom are you going to call? And number one. Number two, I'm also hearing very clearly that for a variety of reasons, both pragmatic as well as commercial, as well as from a regulatory compliance standpoint, responding to these attacks is not something that companies should take on by themselves, but it does require external resources on the legal, operational security side to understand what actually has occurred and what the options are, to use Jeff's term, in terms of responses. And a variety of things have to be obviously weighed. Understand whom you're dealing with, understanding the efficacy, if at all, of any negotiation, disclosure points, regulatory compliance and not dealing with the wrong people, and being able to have access to the known lists of entities that the U.S. and international governments might be concerned about, and to basically help with resiliency, whether it's both in terms of working with insurance companies, but also obviously in the recovery of the data and the understanding of what has occurred. And as a number of children's shows, I think still, maybe not on TikTok, Jeff and Mike, but I say, kids, don't try this at home. This is very much a risk that where pattern recognition and checklists, and people who have been through this before, where having the ability to access and leverage their expertise can be extraordinarily valuable. but this is certainly something that is important for enterprises to apply forethought and preparation to.
I agree completely with that. It's a great summary, David. And to be very practical to your, statement, think about it this way. It's common knowledge within the industry that there is a proliferation of tools, tactics, and procedures. What do I mean by that? Since so much cyber incident activity has occurred over the years, all of these tools are out there in many different ways, and all of the ways of victimizing an enterprise are out there. So different threat actors use the stuff that works for their objectives. So a nation's own cyber teams have used a bunch of things, and the criminals have seen them, and they may use those things too. So when you think about attribution, knowing what those tools, tactics, and procedures are help us group the actors, and that's good. And it helps security technology companies defend against those technical fingerprints, and that's good too. But when you need to be exceptionally distinct and precise in attribution, you want to also have the ability to look at the language that's used in a negotiation. Those patterns can be exceptionally useful as well, because in the end, we are dealing with people at the other end of a keyboard who are trying to achieve a criminal objective. Perhaps in the future, we will just be dealing with machines, and that will perhaps have a different set of ramifications. But today, it's people. And acknowledging that with things like AI, those people are getting better at looking and feeling like someone that we should trust, and that is a concern. But I think we're moving into a paradigm where the technical fingerprinting of an attack for attribution, as incredibly useful as that is in defense, will not be enough to clear the threshold of requirement when trying to make a determination on who the bad guy really is. So I think that adds some context to the conversation we're having right now.
So I want to thank both of you. I also want to mention to the audience we'll be doing a webinar with a tabletop exercise, which will bring all these points home, because we'll go through a hypothetical that will continue to shift and highlight some of these points. And in my attempt to summarize the nuggets of information that you guys have shared with the audience today, I did leave something out which is obvious but needs to be underscored, which both Mike and you, Jeff, have alluded to the fact that this is an evolving threat. It's not static. The threat actors, increasingly apply new and innovative means and technologies to affect this. Maybe a reasonable metaphor might be the game of whack-a-mole. Something gets, you knock the mole down, and the mole pops back up in another location or in another way. But also, Jeff, just recently in your remarks, you alluded to the fact that there's a lot of foreign state sponsorship of these activities, which translates as they're being very, very sophisticated. And quite frankly, if U.S. government agencies are often targeted and sometimes successfully, this is an arms race that very few institutions are able to compete against on a playing field. So once again, the reason to continue to rely on outside expertise, leverage what you have internally, and continue to run different scenarios through your own system. So in any event, I want to thank you guys for your public service, which has transcended not only your time on the New York City's payroll, but throughout the private sector. You've been very, very generous in sharing time and information and speaking at various conferences and on various panels. So look forward to more to come. And again, thanks.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the RANE Insights podcast from RANE Network. For more information on how to prepare for, respond to, and prevent cybercrime for your organization, visit the links in the description for guidance provided by the CISA and Arete. Dive into everything RANE has to offer in cybersecurity and discover how your organization can mitigate, monitor, and respond to an abundance of emerging risks by visiting ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. Thank you for listening.